Okay. Okay, so this is where we ended last Thursday, and I wanted to stop here. I want to just state for a minute what is meant by reflex. Okay. Um, a reflex is a behavior that doesn't need to be learned. Okay. So when we talk about, for example, here in a little while, we'll talk about the average age of walking. Walking starts with the crawling reflex and then moves into a learned behavior of walking bipedal on our 2 feet. So what we're talking about right here is something that is biologically fixed for us. Okay. The other thing that I want to make sure that we make very clear, though, is that there is great variability in both the reflexes and the more complex learned behaviors that we'll go over in a little while. This is just averages. So if you don't see these reflexes disappearing or are there right away, this it doesn't mean that your child is necessarily delayed. So I just wanted to just bring that up. But what are we born with? What behaviors are we born with? Well, of course, we know the sucking reflex. When something touches or the roof of the baby's mouth, lips, even if you rub their little cheek, they'll start the sucking reflex. Okay. What frustrates, I think, a lot of moms who especially breastfeed is while the sucking reflex is a natural thing that the infant does, attaching to the breast necessarily isn't something natural. That it's something because a baby will suck at any reflex, any touch around their lips or on their cheek or anywhere. But teaching the infant how to get nutrition, for example, from the mother's breast actually can take a little bit of work because it's more of a complex behavior between mom and the infant. So I think this tends to be for some moms, this tends to be a real frustration for them. Is the actual eating is a learned behavior rather than the natural reflex of sucking. Crawling reflex is when the baby first is on his little tummy, and then he gets up on his little legs and makes a crawling motion, even though he is not able to move forward. So we see from a very young age, and this starts to kind of disappear at about 2 months. If you put an infant on their stomach and they're awake, they will start to make those crawling motions with their arms and their legs. Okay. And this again is a preparation to go from that phase to then having the muscular ability to crawl, then to walk. Okay. More reflex, or what's called the startle reflex, is when babies lose support and feels like they're falling or hears a loud sound and they startle. It's really kind of, as it explains, or the startle reflex. And if we go back to some famous studies, this is where we feel that a lot of fears are developed. So when an infant sees mom or dad, I think I've seen this more in men than women, so I should use dad as an example. When dad sees a spider and he, screams or goes in fear, that then more reflex happens in the infant, and that's where we think fear comes from or phobias come from. And it comes from a famous study by what is his name? Oh goodness. Excuse me just a second. John B. Watson, sorry. I had to look his name up. Um, John B. Watson was the what was known as the father of behaviorism, and he did what's called the Little Albert experiment. And it's, I will say, this experiment could not be conducted today because it wouldn't go through an ethics committee board, but understanding the time and place, I just want to make sure that everyone knows this would not be done today in modern psychology. But what he wanted to do is using this Moore reflex, the startle reflex, he wanted to show that fears are classically conditioned. Okay. So what he did with a little infant, because he wanted to use infants because he didn't want any prior learning to have taken place yet. And he knew that the Moore reflex was that startle reflex was a reflex that an infant is pretty much born with. Okay. And so took little Albert and he put like a little white rat in front of little Albert, and little Albert would, play with it. It would, do what little babies do, pick it up and try to put it in his mouth, and, you know, nothing to do with fear or anything of the little white rat. But then in the next phase of the experiment, Watson would present the little white rat and then do a loud cymbal sound behind little Albert's head, which created the startle reflex. Okay, and he paired the little white rat with a loud noise, and of course, little Albert was having this reaction. And then after some time, Watson just presented the little white rat, and little Albert would go nuts. He would do the startle reflex right away. And then there's what we call the rule of generalization. Little Albert became afraid of anything white and fluffy. So it could be a bunny rabbit, it could be a stuffed white animal, teddy bear or something. And he generalized that fear response. Okay. Now, the unethical part of this is that we don't know what happened to little Albert. There was, by the time ethics came along and people were like, we need to go find little Albert, we think he passed away at a young age. And so no counter conditioning was ever done for him. And that's a huge controversy in psychology about what actually happened to little Albert after these experiments. But anyways, going back to the Moore reflex, this is kind of what has been known about fears and phobias, that they are actually a learned behavior. And this is what I mean by simple behaviors to complex behaviors. So the Moore reflex to phobias and fears. Okay. And you can see the complexity. All behaviors are built off of these reflexes, as we will see. Just like with the crawling reflex, you crawl, or you do the motions of crawling, you crawl, then you walk. And it should be noted that this is where I meant the variability of these things, because there are infants who go directly from the crawl reflex, meaning that they're not crawling, they're just doing the motions when set on their belly, to walking. And so I just bring that up because it brings up the variability in all these things. My son, in fact, never crawled. He went from the crawl reflex, and then a couple months later, he was on his two legs and walking. And I've known, and on the reverse end of this, I've seen children as old as almost 2-3 years old that were still having a difficult time learning how to walk. And so I bring this up because I want to bring up the variability in these things. All right, going back to the Morphex. Let's finish Watson right now, because when we get to adolescence and young adult, we're going to talk about intimacy and love. And as we get into young adulthood and middle adulthood, late adulthood, is there evidence that you can stay in love with one particular person your entire life? Yeah. So Watson, during the little Albert experiments, and this is the other kind of unethical thing that Watson did, is he started having an affair with the graduate assistants. If you look up little Albert, you'll see that the graduate assistant is there in the experiments because he wanted to record it for prosperity reasons. Um, anyways, after the experiments ended and the university worked for said, hey, either you break off this relationship with your graduate student or you resign. Watson said, okay, I'm resigning, I'm done. He went and divorced his wife and married his graduate assistant. All right, awful for his wife. I feel completely bad for her. It was cheating, it was all that thing. But for Watson, he did spend his life completely and totally in love with this individual. In fact, she passed away 10 years before he did. And he spent the last 10 years of his life in exclusion in his home. He wouldn't talk to anyone. He spent his last 10 years in a complete and total depression because he missed her so much. Also, and we should bring this up, this is also if you've taken Psych 101 or something, you know that psychology can be both a profession and a science. He started off as a science, but after he left university, he went into marketing, and he actually was very successful in it. He made a lot of money in the marketing field because one of his first things was working with a coffee company. And back then, there was starting to be a lot of competition for coffee, and 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 this coffee company came to him as a psychologist. How do we increase purchases of our coffee and everything else? And back then, in order to increase sales, you had to increase quality of the product. And Watson disagreed with that. He said, no, all you have to do is make your packaging more appealing. So what they did is they did the regular coffee and just block letters. And then they had another coffee can with all these artsy designs in it and all this flashy stuff on it. And in both cans was the same exact product. But people purchased the fancy can at a 500% increase over the plain can. So what he showed is in order to increase sales, you don't have to increase the quality of your product. You just have to change the packaging and make the packaging more appealing. I always call this the macaroni and cheese effect, where people swear that the Kraft macaroni and cheese is much better than the off-brand of macaroni and cheese, even though if you go to the store and you look at the bottom of the boxes and you look where they were manufactured, they usually come from the same exact factory. But people swear that the Kraft macaroni is a better product. And this is that example. Anyways, I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, but again, we'll come back to this when we get to young adulthood and adolescence and everything. Is it possible to be in love with someone your entire life? Absolutely. Just don't do it like Watson did it in the beginning. Just stay away from that behavior if you can. All right. So the next one is the steeping reflex. This is when the baby's weight, if you support the baby's weight and let his feet touch the ground, he will lift and set his feet and do a walking motion. So this is in the first one, we have the Moore reflex and the crawling reflex. Now we can see that if you put an infant just above the ground, as if they were standing, they'll actually start moving their legs, which is an indication that infants are prepared to walk at birth. Okay. And this is going to disappear around about 3 months of age. Tonic neck is when a baby is placed on his or her back and head turns to the side, and then they'll stretch. If you'll ever notice that, they'll stretch out their arms, they'll stretch out everything, and they'll kind of, it's almost like they're getting really comfortable. This is this reflex. Um, the Babinski reflex is when you stroke the side of the baby's foot. So just on the side, so more on the outer side, not the inner side of the baby's foot. Their big toe points up, and other toes will fan out. Um, and again, this this Babinski reflex, if you'll notice, if you put a baby in water, they will naturally swim. I've seen TikToks where they take little ones and they just throw them in the pool and they do this. This Babinski reflex, if you think about it, goes back to probably our ancestry line when we had web feet and we had to use that for swimming. Okay. The rooting reflex, this is the one where I said if you touch the baby's cheek, they will turn in the direction where the touch is and begin the sucking reflex. So this rooting reflex actually stays much longer than the sucking reflex. Okay. So the rooting reflex will actually go up to 4 months of age, where if you rub their cheek, they'll look at your where you're stroking, and they'll do this little smile, and then they'll go into the sucking reflex. The palmar grasp is when you touch a baby's palm with your index finger. They'll clench it. I don't know if anyone's noticed it. It kind of feels good because it feels like a baby is holding your hand. They'll just grab it, and they'll hold on to it. Okay. Now there's two reflexes that don't disappear over time. The first one is the gag reflex. And this is when the throat contracts and expels objects of large that are ingested. This reflex gag helps to prevent choking, obviously, right? The interesting thing about the gag reflex and discussed as we'll see it, okay? The stronger the gag reflex in infancy, okay? So if you just put your hand and it's a solid object on a little infant and they gag to it, they also will have difficulties later in life with things like attractiveness, smell, and they'll be much, much more pickier about who they will date and who they will be with, because the disgust, as you would say, reflex, it's a gastral intestinal thing in the same area of the brain that lights up when you have a gag reflex, like a reflex. That same area of the brain lights up when you find something disgusting. Okay. And so the more sensitive this system is, the more sensitive you're going to be later in life to, even, for example, going into a yard that has dog poop on it, or when the kitty litter hasn't been changed often enough, and you just start to gag to those kind of things. This goes way back into infancy and this gag reflex, because it's not actually about the stimuli, it's about this natural reflex that we have. And some infants don't have the gag reflex very often. And then there's some infants that instantly, when they feel something touch their lips, they'll start gagging. And it's kind of an interesting association between things like that. And when I studied intimacy, for example, we find that people who will date a variety of people have a very slow gag reflex. People who are very, very, very picky about who they date have a very quick gag reflex. So this is going to follow us, but it's going to follow us not only with food and those kinds of things, but it's going to follow us socially as we develop and we grow. The blinking reflex, and this one was never goes away, is when eyes blink when touched or exposed to sudden bright lights. We actually blink, I believe. Don't quote me on this. I need to look it up, but we blink like 120 times in a minute, but we don't see it. It's something like that. It's something ridiculous that is not, and we're not even aware of it. But the blinking reflex never goes away. If something touches our eye, we will instantly blink. This is why, but again, this is one of those things that has great variability. So I'm willing to bet you all know someone who have contact lenses and they have no problem putting them in, putting them out. But then there's some people who cannot simply wear contacts because they can't keep their eye open enough to put the contact lens in. I'm actually one of those people. I'm stuck with glasses because the moment something comes within an inch of my eyes shut. And again, I'm just bringing this up like I did with the gag reflexes. There's great variability in some of these reflexes. Okay. So the point of this slide is to show the difference between what are known as gross motor skill versus fine motor skills. Gross motor skills are moving large muscle groups. So, for example, walking and those kinds of things. So they require our larger muscle to move. Fine motor skills are those things that are delicate. They're like lips and tongue, fingers. Being able to write is an example of a very fine motor skill. Being able to use language is lips and tongue, and movement of those are all examples of this. We start with gross motor skills, and then we fine tune those into fine motor skills. And this is largely associated with myelination of the motor neurons. And the way that our motor neurons become myelinated. So when we're talking about motor neurons, we're talking about the neurons that are outside the spinal cord and go to the muscle systems throughout the body. So you literally do have like for example, a motor neuron that is about, depending on your height, anywhere from 3 to 4 feet going down to your bottom legs from your spinal cord. Okay. And those are the ones that become myelinated first. Okay. And this is what's called cephalocodal and proximodistal. Sorry, meaning it starts from the head down. So you'll notice that children will start to speak sooner than they will be able to use their big arms and their legs and everything else. And then proximal is from the torso outward, meaning that we develop from gross motor skills to fine motor skills from the center of our body to the extremities of our bodies. So our last fine motor skills are the ones dealing with our hands and being able to manipulate our feet. And if you notice, this has a great association with our reflexes, that a lot of our reflexes are preparing us to do these more complex behaviors with our fine motor skills. So we're getting ready to crawl and then walk, grasp things with the palmar reflex. So from the beginning, it seems that biology and evolution, whatever you want to call it, prepared us to get to those fine motor skills. And so this is the point of the proximal development, is that we start with our torso. That's the first thing that we have complete control over, and then our arms, and then our hands, and then our fingers. And we could say the same thing: torso, legs, feet, toes. And this is how we develop as we go through the developmental phases physically. All right, so we go from reflexes to motor skills. And you'll notice if we were to overlay those reflexes, this is what then develops into these motor skills. So holds head erect and steady. This happens usually by, on average, 1 to 6 months. The range is 0.7 to 4 months. Sits without support. So you can see this proximal torso development, right? So we have our head and the head down proportion. So the head down, we're able to hold our head erect. And then in the torso area, we're able to sit up with support. And then we're able to lift our shoulders, forearms while lying down. And this is important. This happens between about 3.5 months, and you can see the range. Sits momentarily without support by about 5.3 months. Reaches with one hand. Rolls over, and I'm not going to go through all these, but we're going to go walk independently, 11.7 to about 9 to 16 months. But and I encourage you to do this, if you go back and you overlay the reflexes, each reflex kind of supports each of these milestones as the little infant is able to do this. Now, I'm going to say this once again. If my kiddo can't walk independently by 6 months, does that mean he or she is developmentally delayed or something? The answer to that question is no, absolutely not, no. Because it may just be because of the situational that infant is in. So it might just be due to some either genetic predisposition or something else that the infant is just not capable of that milestone at that point. A good example of this is one of my grandbabies. Okay, I'm going to bring up my grandbaby, and I'm going to bring up my son. My grandbaby is at about he's going 3 to 4, and he's barely starting to use language, words. He can do sign language, but the words are just very difficult for him. He's learning how to do sentences. And please don't get me wrong, this is not a fault of my daughter, but my daughter spent most of the time with my grandson finishing anything he was trying to express. Instead of letting him express the full sentence, she would always finish what and kind of do that. So that's an environmental contingency that then plays a role into his development. Is he developmentally delayed? No. His situation is what created it. My son, for example, when he started learning language and everything, he learned it at a very young age. But that's because his dad was in college and he had to read these things they call textbooks. And so my son's nighttime stories was me reading textbooks because I was trying to just kind of combine the two. And so from a very, very early age, my son, I entered college when my son was 4 months of age. And the thing that I instantly did is I tried to combine storytelling with textbook reading. And I would suggest that to anybody, any of the moms or dads in the room, if you have an infant, replace the child's book with your textbook. They don't know what you're saying, but they're learning the afflections of the words you're saying. And I'd recommend that to any. But the point being is that if I look at the fluency of my grandson and the fluency of my son, that they would have been they're basically at the same point now. So is my grandson developmentally delayed? No. Was my son somehow a genius and was able to do language at a very early age? No, because about by the age of about 4, 5, or 6, they're going to be equivalent. I just wanted to bring that up as a point of view, um, by saying human existence is just very variable, and I want you to keep that in mind. And I think that's the purpose of this next slide, is that motor development is highly canalized, but may go slower for some infants. Cognitive development tends to outpace motor development, as we will see. Infants develop language sometimes before they can develop even walking. And there's variation in experience, and we could bring up what's called the Kenya Parents Experiment and Back to Sleep program. And what these two systems found is that parenting practices highly affect infant development and growth. And we'll get into these a little bit later. The point being is that infant development is a very dynamic system. And if you remember what I said from the beginning, when it comes to early childhood, our infants' brains are not fully developed. They're developing in a social, cultural environment that then creates variability dependent upon the exposure that infant has. But as we will see, as milestones occur, they tend to occur within a dynamic range. So, for example, we know that physical development, psychological development between boys and girls greatly varies in youth. And so we see young girls being able to do things like math and logic thinking much sooner than boys. And then boys are able to do more physical things at much younger ages than girls. But those in IQ, those physical things tend to wash out by the age of 21, 22. And so that's the thing about being human, is it's a very dynamic system and a great variability in those. All right. This is probably one of the most interesting experiments that we have with infants. Is infants have depth perception at a very, very young age. As early as 6 months, this is one the reason why we say 6 months is because at 6 months, uh, infants tend to be mobile. We think infants are actually born with this ability. And this comes from what's called the visual cliff experiment. Okay. And so you see, now don't worry, there's a very thick glass piece right here. So if the little infant decides, hey, I'm going to go to dad in this example, they can go and that nothing will happen. But they come across this environment and they come to this edge right here. And they can actually see that there's a drop. And so the infant becomes very hesitant. It's like the infant doesn't know what to do. Okay. And this is when we also start using social cues. So we thought infants were mindless until about 24 months. No, they're just as sociable as us as adults. Because what happens is the infant stops here and he looks at the parent usually to try and figure out what to do with this situation. Should they continue on or should they stop? Okay, if the parent's reaction is hold, no, don't, they have their full hands up and they're don't, the infant will stay right here and they won't move. And in fact, sometimes they'll cry. But as this example is, if the parent is very opening and saying, come here, the infant will look and go, I'm not sure about this, but I trust my parent. I'm not sure about this, but I trust my parent. And they will actually, because the parent is saying it's okay, the little infant will cross the threshold, okay, and come to the parent. If we now go from this experiment, this cognitive perceptual experiment to you remember last week or a week before that, I said we can show infant pictures of good people versus bad people. And if we make this analogy, if we showed a picture of a bad person, the baby would stay here. If we showed a picture of a good person, the infant would cross the barrier. Let's use this as an example. All right. In a lot of situations, this is where parents, I don't want to use the F word, but I'm going to say F things up. Because what the parent does, if you think about this visual cliff thing, is they start to teach their children that bad people can be good for them and good people can be bad for them because of their approach behaviors versus their withdraw behaviors. So little infants at this age, if you think of this analogy of the visual cliff thing, if mom and dad are in a rotten relationship with someone, but they're showing care and love for that person, that very, very abusive child, partner, excuse me, not child, that parent is showing that you should care for and you should love an abusive person. What this infant is learning is it's okay then to cross that artificial barrier and embrace that abusive, sick person. Hence, we think as social psychologists, using this visual cliff example is why infants stop seeing the difference between bad people and good people. And because in parents, some parents will embrace those evil people and show care and concern and love for them, that the infant then will go across that field where they were apprehensive in the beginning and go with the parent's command. So I want you to think of this visual cliff not only as a motor skill, but think of the parent's reaction to this motor skill. And that's kind of what we're going on with social psychologists when we see very young children learn that bad people are good people and good people are the people you should be apprehensive about. And this is one of our current ideas using this visual cliff example. The other thing that we should note is that infants tend to need sleep a lot more. So we see this from newborn to 1 year of age. We see that the number of hours of sleep go down even compared to the total numbers of nighttime versus the nighttime that parents sleep. And again, we'll get into this later in the semester. Our memories, what we learn, everything we do is consolidated during sleep. When you deprive yourself of sleep, you remember less. And if you think about this, newborns to about 3 months, what are they doing? They're learning language. They're learning how to care for themselves. They're learning how to interact with the world. And so they need a lot of sleep. and then that decreases over time, you can see that maybe as adults we should take um, we should take advice from our infants and probably should get more sleep than what we actually do, because that's I like using this term because everyone thinks the term intelligence is awesome, because that means you're a Einstein the more intelligent you are. If us as adults got more sleep, we would consolidate more memories and we can do much more. If you look at, for example, the Einsteins, the Newtons, the Ben Franklins, um, the Four Nations people of the Americas that actually our Constitution is written off of, that the United States Constitution is written off. They all put premium on sleep. Einstein took like 3 naps a day. Newton, because you know the fable of the apple falling on his head because he was sleeping under an apple tree, that probably never happened. But Einstein slept a lot during the day. Not Einstein, I'm sorry. Newton. Slept. He took like 3 or 4, sometimes 5 naps a day. And so I want you to think about this as you develop and you grow. We think that we should do crunch time. We think we shouldn't do sleep. We should stay up and be productive. But what we learn from newborns and what we learn from geniuses is sleep is our most productive time, where we learn, we develop, we grow. In fact, it was Newton who said, if you want to find a problem, define the problem, take a nap, and I promise when you wake up, you'll have the solution. Just something to note based on this graph. I do want to bring this up. I'm actually going to bring my pin up. The cry it out method. So this is when parents are so frustrated because their kiddo is waking up so many times, and they go to their pediatrician, say, is there something wrong with my child? And pediatricians go, no, you're just spoiling that infant. And so they're going to cry any moment that they have. So the best thing you should do as a parent is let your baby cry it out. I'm going to tell you, there is no empirical evidence. You will not find one single research article after 1980 that supports the cry it out method. You may be able to Google it and find some bullshitter that says cry it out works, like one of those bloggers or someone like that. But they're full of shit. I'm just going to put this out here bluntly, and I'm going to bring this out very clearly. The cry it out method has negative effects on infants. I'm going to repeat that again. Every evidence collected since 1980, when the cry it out method in the 60s and 70s was largely promoted by pediatricians. Since the 1980s, there is no evidence from scientists who have studied child development since they were doing their bachelor's degree, have found any positive effect on the cry it out method. But I will promise you, you will go to some medical doctor who's a pediatrician, and they will say the cry it out method works. With my son, that was my pediatrician's recommendations. With some of my grandchildren's, That was their pediatrician's thing, recommendation when a child was more colicky than should have been. Just leave them there, let them cry it out. Okay, I'm going to say this one more time from a scientific perspective. The cry it out method has more negative consequences and will not correct the infant's behavior. Respond to your infant, go to them, cuddle with them, hug them, feed them, change them every time. And if you can't do that, maybe you weren't prepared to be a parent. Sorry, this is a subject I'm very passionate about, gang. I will get off my soapbox and go back to our lecture. I'm sorry, I kind of went on a soapbox there for a moment. It's just I've never found any serious science that supports that. And I think it's neglectful and it's abusive. All right. The last thing I think we want to go over for today is stress and coping. Okay. We know when we become stressed, we start to release something called cortisol, which is the hormone that prepares the body for threats and challenges. Basically, that fight or flight response. That we're going to stand our ground or we're going to get away from that situation. That's what cortisol really prepares our body for. I mentioned Piaget in the beginning. He said stress is important for children to experience, and it is the parent's job to prepare to set the safe boundaries for that stress to occur. Okay. This is what we mean by this from a physical developmental perspective, is that in small amounts, stress is important for infants and young children to experience, for them to experience it safely and for them to learn something from it. Okay. We found, though, for example, when children are raised in a neglectful, abusive home where stress is a constant, that ongoing stress can actually create brain damage in an infant. In fact, in a most stressful, abusive home that an infant, they can end up with what's called a TBI, traumatic brain injury, the same as if a adult in the military ends up with a TBI from a roadside bomb. Okay, I want you to listen to this again just one more time because I want to bring this home. When an infant is raised in a chaotic, abusive, continuous environment, they can end up with traumatic brain injury at the same level that an adult in the military who experiences a roadside bomb and ends up with a TBI has the same brain injury. All right. I just want to bring this out because this is a very important point. Stress is important. It's important for our learning. It's important for our coping. It's important for our adaptation. But when the parent does not take responsibility for making sure that that is done in a controlled, safe environment, TBIs in infants can be the same as a TBI for a military person who had a roadside bomb. Now, with that being said, remember what I told you about the plasticity of the infant's brain, and that the brain in infants can adapt much better than adults. if that infant, even though they've been very neglected or very abused or in a very chaotic environment, if they are put into an environment with a sensitive caregiver, okay, and this is the difference between adult TBI, military TBI, and infant TBI. We know that infants who are taken out of a very abusive, neglectful, drug-ridden environment and they're put in a caring, sensitive home, those effects of those stress damage can be reversed. All right. And so when we think about infants being removed from homes and all these things, just remember this association. It's not about us, it's about those little kiddos and those children who need that consistency, that less stressed environment, that less thing. So when we think of the evils of our social services system, this is the goal because the parents are unable to provide that. And I just want you to think about that, especially for my social workers in this class. Remember this physical association. Remember, we're not talking about cognition or socio-emotional development. We have not even gone there. We are still talking about actual physical development. We haven't even gone into the cognitive and socio-emotional, which most people think abuse and everything affects a child's cognition and a child's socio-emotional development. Folks, no, we're in the physical development of an infant. You'd think we would be talking about this in the cognition and socio-emotional section, but we're not. We're talking about actual physical brain development. And if it's not caught at an early date and an early age, this is what we end up with. Just like a military person can't come back from war and have their brain healed. If we allow this to continue, the infant will have a warred brain where some roadside bomb exploded and hurt them. This isn't psychological, this is physical. Sorry, I'm on another soapbox with that. Okay, here we are. Okay, so I'm gonna escape out of here because I need to get off my soapbox and pay attention to you guys and make sure we're all on the same page. So I'm gonna escape out of here. I'm gonna stop sharing. I'm gonna stop recording.